Welcome back to part 2 of this series where we are rebuilding a Linear's website, and today we're gonna add animations in here. This will be a super nice video to watch and I hope you will learn a lot from it. If you look on the right, you actually see the result which we made in part 1 of this video. In part 1, we mainly focus on setting everything up, adding in the header and the footer, and making sure that we were ready to go to build everything the homepage brings in the next video. And you know what? The next video is now. Let me quickly fast forward a little bit to the future to also show you what we're actually going to build in this part. So what you're looking at now is the end result of part 2 of this video. In this part, we're going to focus mainly on making the hero component, but it's not just a hero component. If you look at the bottom, there is this image that has so many micro animations in it. If I refresh the page, you see that everything animates in. There's a glow, there's like all of these sketch lines in the background, there's these light lines going from left to right on this image. There are so many details in here, and that is what we're gonna learn today. So I hope you're ready for it, because I'm already from the future and I am really excited by what I built. I hope you learn a lot today. Let's get it started. Oh, and by the way, maybe you were already thinking, what's that blue bar on the top you see in my browser? It's actually the new developer mode that has been released, I think today or yesterday. That is part of the Arc browser that I use. You can find it on arc.net. So any people commenting, this is where you should go and you should really try it yourself, because to me, it feels like a really refreshing take for a browser. But now let's build this website. After we finished last week's first episode, I've actually been clicking a bit through the website and I noticed a few things that are still not 100% correct. For example, if we go back to the desktop version and go to the footer, we see that there's actually no hover animation yet. So that's one thing that I still quickly want to add in, because you need to have hover states, right? And we can do that by setting hover text white and a transition of colors. And when we do that, we see that we already have a super neat hover effect. That's one detail that was still lacking. The other thing I noticed, which is something you might have seen in other websites as well, but I kind of hate it when it happens, is that if you go to the responsive version and resize your browser, what you see happening is that there is a second where the mobile navigation animates away when you go from desktop to mobile. And now, most of the time, end users, of course, won't really do this unless they rotate their device. This might happen, but it's just a minor annoyance that I don't really like. And if you know how to fix it, it's a pretty easy fix. So that's also a thing I quickly want to add in, because it makes things just that much nicer. So let's quickly open the header file. And a really nice trick to do this is actually by, on mobile, also putting the navigation off screen on the x-axis. But don't animate that. And as soon as you do that, you will see that it's simply not visible when it's closed on mobile, but it also doesn't animate because it's immediately put to the left side of the screen. So we can do that by adding translate x of 0 when the navigation is open, and adding a translate x of -100 the viewport width when the navigation is closed. And if we save that and change the size of our browser, you see that actually nothing is happening. And that's because on desktop, the navigation is always in a closed state, because this Boolean only does something on mobile. So the other thing we need to add is also make sure that we add the translate x of 0 on medium and up. So that way on medium and up, the navigation is never moved off the screen. And when we do that, you already see that the flicker is gone from the mobile navigation. The only thing that's still happening now is that the links animate up, because they have their own animation that also toggles when going from mobile to desktop. And perhaps you think it's nice because this looks pretty okay, I think. But to me, it still gives the feeling that it's not 100% perfect, that it's an animation that actually should not be there. So let's also fix that. And this animation is actually set on the unordered list because in there we style all of the anchors that are children of the navigation. And you see that if we scroll here, that it has both a transition on color and transform. Because if the hamburger is open, the translate will become 0. Otherwise, it will have a translation of 20 on the y-axis. But what we can do is, instead of applying this transition always, is add in this transition again, but then for medium only, and then give it transition colors. So that means that on medium and up, it will only transition the colors and not the transform again. So if we save this, you already see that now only the fade is still animating. And that fade is happening because on the nav, we're also transitioning the opacity still. So we can do the same trick for the navigation on the opacity. We can add a medium breakpoint with transition none on there. And if we add transition none, you suddenly see that the navigation just goes from a mobile view to a desktop view, and that's it. And if we open or close the navigation, you see that that is still working. In my opinion, this is so much better. One final thing I still want to do from the previous version is when you open the navigation, it looks like this is working perfectly, but actually what's happening is, and you can see that the scroll bar of the page is still active. You can see it in the top navigation, you can see the page behind it. And that's because this navigation is fixed. So it just lies on top of it, but the user can still scroll. And especially if the navigation would become quite high and you would have scroll bar in there as well, you would have like 2 different scrolls and that becomes very weird. So one fix for that is setting a class that applies a scroll lock, which actually means that you cannot scroll in the HTML anymore when the navigation is open. So that's still one thing I also want to add in. So how we want to achieve that is actually by running a use effect when the navigation state toggles. So we can add the hamburger menu is open in here. And in that effect, we're actually gonna document.querySelector HTML. So we have the HTML, and then we can add, and now Copilot again knows what I want to write. You can toggle a class based on the Boolean. So if we autocomplete this, we see that we can run a toggle based on the Boolean whether the hamburger is open or not. And the only thing that is still complaining about now is that potentially the HTML element would be null because that's the type query selector gives us back. So we could change this in if HTML and only then toggle the class list. But if we now open the navigation, we see, well, probably you don't see it, you can't scroll anymore. And that's actually a good thing because now there's no unnecessary scroll bars on the page anymore. So in my opinion, this is also a must we have to add. The only issue with this potentially is if we have the navigation open, upscale the page to the desktop view again, we still can't scroll. And that is because we don't remove the overflow clause if you resize your browser. For that, we can add another effect in here where we add window.addEventListener resize. And in there, we're going to add a function in a second. But what's also important to add is also an event listener orientation change, because if you rotate your device, you also might go from mobile to desktop view and vice versa. So in there, we're also going to add this function. And the function we're going to call close hamburger navigation. And that sets set hamburger menu is open to false. So that means this is a dependency of our use effect. And then we pass this function in here as well as in here. And then we also need to return a cleanup function for React. So that means, yep, thank you, Copilot, that we need to remove the event listener for both the orientation and resize to not close the hamburger anymore when this effect gets unmounted. If we do that and we go back to the mobile view, we open the navigation and we see that the overflow class is added. If we resize, we see that the navigation closes and that the class also gets removed. You could add in a window check to check if you're going beyond a certain width, beyond the medium breakpoint. But for me, it feels fine to, if you resize your browser, close the navigation, because users won't do this unless they're rotating their device or as a developer trying and experimenting with everything. So it's fine to not check the size, which is also more performant. And with that, we finally have this first part really wrapped up, including all the nice details. And to me, that is what Frontend is about. It's all about these details. So let's see what we're going to build next, right? So the first thing we're still lacking is having this really nice gradient on the top of our page, because on our version, it's still black, and that gradient, again, makes such a big difference in the experience. So if we inspect that wrapper div, we see that this is a radial gradient. So we're going to copy that in, and then we're going to go to our hero component, and we're going to add in this gradient. The only thing with Tailwind is that you cannot add a radial gradient with an arbitrary value or with any other of the class name props. So for that, we should actually first add it to our Tailwind configuration. I'm not really sure yet what the right name for this gradient would be, because it totally depends on where it's used. So for now, I'm going to stick with hero gradient. And in there, we can just add in the gradient that we copy pasted from the website. And since we don't have this transparent variable, I'm going to replace this with transparent. We also later on need to look at all of these purple RGB values because they're brand colors, but for now, all of them are not repeated yet. So let's see later on if we can abstract them into a color in the theme as well. If we now go back to our hero, we can add this as a BG hero gradient, which in our case actually, and that's probably because I looked at their code, it should not be on the hero element, but on the main of our page, because we have added the padding to the main element. We could again later decide that it's smarter to do this on the hero, but for now, especially since we're only building one page, I'm going to add this to the main element. The main element lives inside the layout, where we then can add BG hero gradient. And then that also means that we need to rename it. It's not a hero gradient, of course, anymore. It's a BG page gradient, for example. We're going to rename this as well, page gradient. And with that, we already see that we have this nice, really subtle effect. It's especially visible if I quickly toggle it on and off. You then definitely see it appearing. So next is building out this hero component. Let's start with the mobile view first. This title has a font size of 44 pixels on mobile, which if we look at our Tailwind config, is not part of any size we have defined yet. So we can still add those in. Tailwind suggests an XL of 2.4, a 2XL of 2.8. Does that make sense? Totally depends on what sizes we're gonna have next, of course. Let's see if we go slightly bigger, if it then will already go to the 80 pixels. Yeah, it does. So there's no breakpoint in between. And how about this smaller text? That's font size 18 pixels, which is interesting. We don't have that yet. But problem for later. Okay, so the XL and 2XL, I don't know, we're gonna need it. Let's quickly check a few more font sizes. This button is 16, 18, 18, 26, 16. So we definitely need a 26 still. 26, That one is 48. So we also need a 48, which is just a bit different from this main page title. 44, 24, which is also something we probably need. 24, 14, 14, 24, 40. Also a size we don't have yet. 40. And if we go to desktop, then we have 80 again, which is the 5XL. 16, yeah, we have that. 32, that's new. 32, 80, 16, 32, 80, 22, 22. So those seem to be all the different font sizes. So let's see if we can add a 4XL of 4.8 REM, 4.4 REM, a 2XL of 4 REM, XL of 3.2 REM, and that would bring us to a large of 26 again. So we already have a large of 2.2. So that means that we need to make this 6XL. And it also means that we need to change the 5XL we're using already to a 6 extra large. And then this becomes 5, 4, 3, 2. Extra large is then 2.6 REM. And the large is 2.2. So that means that we need to go one bigger even. 5, 4, 3, 2. And add in the XL as 2.4 REM. And then remove those two. Then we have a complete list. And again, need to change this one to 7. So since all of those are new, we don't need to update those because they're unused. And all of these smaller sizes haven't changed. So this seems to be the full font size spacing scale we have. And again, usually you would get this from a designer in a nice design system and you know all of the sizes up front. But since we're now building this by looking at their website and need to inspect all of the elements, it's quite a bit of work to really get all of the sizes. So that's why we need to do a bit of refactoring now, but that's okay. So as soon as we added in all those correct font sizes, we can go back and see that the font size was 44, which maps to our new 5XL. So that means that it's text 5 extra large, and from medium on, it will become 7 extra large. So if we look and make this smaller, we now see that this text becomes smaller as well. The only thing that is not correct yet is the line height, of course. So let's quickly extract that as well. And line height is 44 pixels, so that's 1 again. So let's add it in immediately for the 5XL. And then I'm going to guess that for the 6 extra large, this will also be the case. And the other ones we will add in when we encounter them. And that's already looking better. And perhaps if you've seen the first video, you remember that we added in this line break, just like Linear does, because that break makes it so that the text looks really nice on desktop. But on mobile, this is kind of annoying for us because now it's breaking in a place where we don't want this. So the way you can fix that is by actually making that line break display none on mobile. So if we go to our page, we can add a class name equals hidden on mobile, and on medium and up, make it block. So this way you see that it now doesn't act like a real line break anymore. Unless we go back to desktop, then it does its magic again. Next is extracting the correct font size from the body text, which is 18 pixels. This is also a size that we don't have yet. So that means that one more time, we need to change all of our font values again. So that means that we get a new large, which will become 1.8 REM, and that all of the other ones will move up 1. And that means if we now go back to our hero, we can set a text large on mobile, and from medium and up, we can make this text extra large. So that way this text scales nicely. Next is also making sure that we add in the right colors. And if you look closely, you also see that there's actually a gradient on the primary title. So let's also add in that gradient. And for that, I'm gonna copy this gradient, but I'm also gonna make it a new utility, so we can apply it easier with only a single class name. And we can add in that new utility by going to our globals file, and in our layer utilities, we can add in a text gradient utility, for example. And in there, we can add a background property where we paste our gradient. And then the magic part of this gradient, because if you look at it, it's just a gradient that goes from the right to the bottom, is the final word that's text. This word, we actually need to copy it out and add on a new line a background clip text. So the text property was used for background clip. And if we do that and we go to our website, we already see that the gradient is applied to the text. Instead, if we remove this, it's just added as a normal background image. And that is actually the magic part of this background clip property. It applies the gradient only to the text. So let's see what else we need to do. I also see that they removed the line break in the text as well. So let's quickly copy in that logic too. So that means that we copy this break again and replace this line break. And that way the text also doesn't go to the next line anymore. And we need to extract the right text size, which seems to be a gray color with a purple-ish tone to it. So let's quickly see if that's also used throughout the rest of the website. Yeah, this seems to be the same color. Yeah. Those subtle colors, man, yeah, so I think this is the first variant of our primary color we are gonna need. I'm gonna copy over this color and go to our Tailwind config. And I'm gonna name this color primary text. And there is no reason for this to be RGB. So if you shift click on this square in front of a color, you can actually change its type, in this case to a hex value. So we can copy that in. And now we can give our text in the hero, which is, subtitle component. We give that text the color of text, primary text. And if we then go back, we already see that this has the correct color. So what's next? I think the next thing I want to do is add in this top button. So that means that we're getting a second variant. So that means that we have to build out our button component again. If we go in here, we see that we already styled the primary button, and we also have a secondary button that was all the way down here when we built this last week. So I'm not sure if there's still a secondary button at all. Doesn't seem to be. So that makes our life easier. That means we don't have a tertiary version anymore, but do have a secondary, which we are going to build now. Let's start with this button as our design inspiration. So this button seems to have a white background color that is of opacity 0.1. So this button seems to have a text color that is off-white. And I was actually quickly looking throughout the rest of the website, and most of their white texts are also off-white. So I'm actually now gonna copy this in and add in another off-white color. And then we're gonna use this off-white everywhere where we use text white, which is in the footer of white, as well as in our general page styling, because that was the color it should have been all the way. Now for the button, we also have text off-white. And if we inspect this, we see that it also has a background of full white with an opacity of 10%. So we're gonna give this a BG white and a BG opacity of 10. This way we have a white background with 10% opacity. Next is to already add this button in so we can see what we're building instead of building this blindly. So we're going back to the page and then add in this button above the title, which has a content of, so let's quickly copy in the content in here, and the href for now is just a slash because it doesn't link anywhere. And then the variant is primary and the size is small because this is our big button, this is our medium, and this is the small button. Oh, and of course it was a secondary button and not the primary button. Okay, and now we're actually at a point where we need to have this top padding, which was 64 pixels, I remember. So we can add that on our container. So that's padding top of 6.4 rem. And let's also see if that was the case on mobile. Yeah, that's the same. Okay. Then we still need to add in the correct padding for the small size as a padding of 12 pixels, which we already added in the previous time. So that's good. Same we actually did for the font sizes. So the thing we still need to add in is the border of this button, which also is a white with opacity. And now this is the third time that we're going to use a border that is a white opacity. We did create a white alpha 8, which is quite close to this 0.05. And I'm actually going to make this a reusable value. I'm not going to make this border 0.05 because I think it brings in more consistency if we make it the same. And my judgment is that it's a little bit off in their design. It actually should have been 0.08. And since we've only used this color for a border until now, I'm also going to rename this color and take out the weird A08 because right now we've discovered that it seems like to be only used for borders. So we're going to rename this for now to border white and remove it to the bottom. And while we're at it, I actually added camel casing in here, which should have been kebab case from the beginning. So let's replace the off-white. It should be off-white. And then we're also replacing the white alpha 08 because now we know what the correct naming should be. And yeah, perhaps you can think this is a bit duplicate border white, but that is because this is the prefix Tailwind gives to all border classes, so not only color but also size, for example. But this border prefix is really important in our color object to really identify that this is used for a color. So we stick with border white for recognizability. Okay, then we go back to the button and make sure that we also add in the border and then border white. So the first class enables the border on the button and this second class sets the color of the border. And if we then go back, we see that we already have the nice border. Next thing still lacking is also the backdrop filter. They've added the blur on this button as well. So let's add that in too. Backdrop filter 12 pixels. And we also need to add in this icon. For this icon, they used a nice HTML entity actually instead of a SVG. So we can copy that one in for now as well. Go back to our page and add in this icon. However, it should of course be wrapped inside something because if you look closely at this icon, you see that there's also a background color and the border on it. So let's in our case make a new component that we call icon wrapper that accepts children, and then it simply returns the span with these children. So we can style it here in a second. So we wrap our icon in our icon wrapper, and then we can take out the background color, which is the same color as the border then in our case. And now we already see that we screwed ourselves with our previous refactor, but this is also building for the web. It's unknown what you're gonna discover next. So I'm actually again gonna rename this border white into a transparent white. And then I'm going to move it back to the whites again. So that means that border white will get replaced with transparent white, so that we can now actually use it on our icon wrapper as well. And instead of adding all the classes in here, I'm only going to give this icon wrapper a class of icon wrapper, because this way we can style it in our variants. Because if you look closely, you see that our primary button also can have an icon. And if we were gonna add it inline, we should know what type of variant the button is rendering, which makes it a bit more complicated. So instead of doing that, I'm adding an icon wrapper here, and underscore dot icon wrapper. And then we can make it bj transparent white. And that will target this element from its parent. To make this a bit more readable, I can actually turn this into an array, where I can add in the second property. So this doesn't do anything. It will still concatenate all of them together, but this way I have a bit more readability. Next is making it rounded full, and also make sure that we get the right padding for this icon, which is 8 pixels on the x-axis. And of course, this icon also has a left margin of 8 pixels as well. And I also see it's pulled negatively of 8 pixels to the right to move a little bit inside the padding of the button. So we can do that by adding margin left of 2 and a negative margin right of 2 as well, which will pull it right inside the padding of the button. As soon as we go really small, this is already starting to look really nice. Also, let's see on desktop if this has a hover state, and it does. It has such a nice glow to it. We can force the hover state by selecting the anchor and then clicking hover in the inspector and then hover here. Then we see that we get a similar white background color, but with a bit more opacity. So we can pretty easily do this by changing this background opacity. So we can say hover bg opacity becomes 20. And that way, if we go back to our website, we already see that the color is similar. We only don't have a transition yet. We can add those in by transition colors, and also add in the ease in to have a bit more similar effect. Amazing. I love it. Oh, and I actually notice now that our gradient in the text is gone, and that's because it's not applied. And the reason is because in order to get background clip text to work, you need to add a color of transparent to your text. Otherwise, the background gradient just will not get applied. So I'm not sure why before it was working, because it should not be. So I've added that in, and now we have the nice gradient back again. Next thing I want to do is also add in the call to action button underneath the text. So let's do that now as well. We can do that by adding the button, which, yes, is size large. Get started. Yeah, right. And of course, we need to get this icon as well, which is an SVG. So we can add a new icon, call it chevron.tsx, chevron icon. And then we can add this icon inside our icon wrapper, chevron icon. So we need to set the fill to current color, so it will inherit the text color. That makes it white. And looking at design, there's also a margin. Yeah, they use the gap property, which is 8 pixels. So we are going back to our button and also add in the icon styles for the primary button, which will be a margin left of 2, which is 8 pixels. And I'm also quickly gonna add a margin top to this image, which is 128 pixels, because that way we can see our button better, right? Class name is margin top 12.8 rem. Okay, one thing that this primary button doesn't have yet is a transition on its hover state. So that means that we still have to add in transition, shadow, and text shadow, which already makes this a lot nicer. And with that, I think we are quite far along with this top hero component. Let's quickly check mobile for one more second. Nice. I'm really happy with this. The only thing it still lacks is if you load this page, you see that there's a really nice animation where everything slowly fades in. That's a super nice detail we still have to add. Normally, you would be able to inspect this animation by clicking on style here, but somehow it points me to an empty style tag. So what I'm going to do is copy this animation name and then go to the network tab and the page and look for this animation to see what it's actually defining for the transition. It's making a transition. Okay, it's this one. Let's copy that out for a second so we can see what it's actually doing. Let's add it here for now. So it seems to be doing a keyframe animation that has opacity 0, goes to 1, and a translate Y that goes from -10 to no translation at all. Okay, let's replicate that in Tailwind. In Tailwind, we do this by going to our config and then add a new keyframes property to our config where we can add an animation, for example, named fade in, like Copilot is already suggesting. And that has a from with opacity 0 and Y of -10 pixels, which should be a string. And then has a to of opacity 1 and Y of none. And next we also need to add in that as an animation. And then we can add fade in as our keyframes with a duration of 1000 milliseconds and 0 seconds delay and an ease as well. And then let's see which elements. So all 4 seem to have gotten an animation. So if we go back to the home page, we can add this class name of animate fade in. And if we then refresh, we should see it animating, but it only fades in. And that actually is because we're not transitioning the Y, but we should animate transform and then translate Y -10 pixels, which was just a mistake by me. Transform none. And if we add that in, we see already that the first button fades in down very nice. We of course still need to add that into our title, which does not accept a class name yet. We'll fix that in a second. Same for the subtitle and for the other button. And then we go to the hero title and add in a class name to the type definition. And then we pull them in here as well. Same for the subtitle. And then we need to add them with the class names package, where we can add in the class name as a second argument. So that again will concatenate both of them together. And that should also be done for the subtitle, where we also concatenate both of them together. And if we then refresh the page, we see that they already fade in nicely. But if we look at Linear's example, you see that they stagger one by one. And if we look at their animation definition, we see that they add in a small delay of 200 milliseconds between each animation. They also created a custom animation for each line that animates. But instead of doing that, I'm actually gonna use CSS variables for this. So instead of adding the 0 second delay in here, we are gonna add a variable called animation delay in here. This variable is non-existent and doesn't do anything yet. But the magic comes when we add this custom variable to, for example, this hero title. You can define a custom CSS variable by using square brackets and then writing -- animation delay and then 200 milliseconds. And then you already saw that this line animated, but the rest does not. And that is actually because we also need to define a default, which we can do here when defining the variable. We just say a 0 as a default. And if we do that, we already see that this second line is animating later. So if we now go ahead and add the animation delay to all the other ones as well, this will become 400. Oh no, 600 because the button, and the subtitle should be 400. And if we now refresh the page, it's like Christmas, right? And that is because by default, they're visible. So instead of, it's actually really funny. Maybe we should leave it like this. This shows I don't prepare these things. I'm writing as I speak, and sometimes I Google a bit, of course, but yeah, this is making me laugh now. Our work is fun, right? Come on. So what I was trying to say is by default, they're visible because there's no style applied. So what actually happens is they're visible until the animation starts. Then it will reset them to opacity 0, and then it will animate them. So what we also still need to do is set these defaults as well. So we can do that by setting opacity 0, as well as the translate of y of -1 rem. And then we can copy that over to all of them. And then it's still like Christmas. And that is because if you run an animation and it completes, it won't stay in the state where it completed. So in order to do that, it is important that we also add in forwards. So that means that it will stop at the end of its animation state. So if we now refresh, we see that nicely all of the animations stack underneath each other. And we've only defined one animation and used the animation delay variable to define the delays that are used for the animation. Isn't it so peaceful? This is what makes my work happy. These peaceful animations. Let's also check this on desktop for a second. It's so nice. And by the way, you might see a flicker every now and then here in the navigation, for example, or a jump with the hero. And that has to do because we're currently in development mode and all of the styles need to be injected by post-CSS. As soon as we build this is not an issue anymore. But perfect. So the final thing I still want to add in this episode is the homepage hero image, and then especially the animation you see when it loads. I mean, look at that. Those people are crazy. And in my opinion, yes, you need to have super engineers who can build this, of course, who know how to build this, which I hopefully can teach you bit by bit. But you also need to have designers who can come up with these super creative things. Because I'm a little bit creative, but I can never come up with these amazing things. Like all of the credits to the designers who came up with this as well. So if we look at this image, we actually see that when you load the page and the image is not for a big portion in view yet, you'll only see a background gradient that's visible. And as soon as you scroll down, there's a few lines that animate in that background, and then the image is added in as well. So the first step is adding this background image in. Let's go back to our page. And then we have this image here, which is currently only the image. And I'm actually gonna copy that out into a new component, which for now we're gonna call hero image.tsx. And that hero image is gonna export this image. So we can render hero image here. And then this should return image we had before. But by default, this image has an opacity of 0 because it will fade in if you scroll down, if you look here. So we need to have some sort of a wrapper div where we can add this background gradient to. So if we inspect this when it's still not animated in, they use a separate div for this, but as I told before, I'm not a really big fan of having divs that are only there for styling. So we tried to do it without adding this. So I'm gonna copy this gradient and add this as a gradient to our div. Since this is a fairly complicated gradient, I'm again gonna copy this into our Tailwind config and add the background gradient. And in this case, we call it hero gradient. That has the value we just copied in. And then we're gonna add to this div a class name that has bg hero gradient. Ooh, funky gradient. So instead of it only being a gradient, they probably do a bit more with it. Oh, and I actually see that this is not the correct gradient. So I copy the correct one now, and I'm going to paste that in the hero gradient. And then we need to replace these transparent variables because we don't have them. And with that, we have the correct color. Then there's probably also a border added to this. And they actually also added a background color. So this background color is BG white, and background BG opacity is 0.01. Next is also adding a border radius of 8 pixels, which is not medium, but large. Yeah. As well as making sure that it's skewed backwards. And skewing backwards is actually translating over the x-axis because the x-axis is horizontal. So it goes from left to right. And if you rotate something along that axis, it will rotate backwards. But watch what happens when I add a rotate on the x-axis. Let's quickly check how much it actually rotated on the x-axis. 25 degrees. So since Tailwind does not support rotate over the x-axis, we have to use arbitrary values. So we could add transform between square brackets and then rotate x 25 degrees. And with that, the rotate of 25 degrees would be added. But if we now look at the image, we see that nothing has happened. And that is because if you rotate anything on the x-axis, you're kind of going 3D. And by default, nothing is 3D in CSS. What you need to do for that is actually enable something that is called perspective. So that perspective should be added on a wrapping div. So if we add one more div, and then again, perspective is also not something that's supported by Tailwind. So we have to use arbitrary values again. We can say perspective 2000 pixels, for example. And with that, you suddenly see that our component skewed backwards. So with this, we kind of tell the browser what the depth of this component is. So right now, we've defined it as 2000 pixels. Now there's also some scroll bars that popped up. And if I disable the mobile view, and for example, resize my browser a bit, you also see that I get scroll bars. Which, by the way, I made a really nice short video about explaining why on Mac you should always enable these scroll bars, because by default they're hidden on Mac because it's sexier. I don't know. But that would mean you might not have spotted this. So I'm going to add overflow hidden now as well to remove these horizontal scroll bars again. One other thing that still lacks is a border around this background, which is again a 1 pixel transparent border. So we can add that in by adding border and border transparent white to our wrapper div. And if we then go back, we already see that the sides of this component become a bit more visible. If we would now remove the opacity from our image for a second, we also see that we already have an image positioned as well. The only thing that's not correct is that there's still a margin added, which is to give it margin from the button. But that margin should now be added to the wrapper div, of course. So let's do that also. And that way you see when we enable the image, that's also skewed. It's also cut off a bit because we're adding the overflow hidden. But since the image will start rotating as soon as a little part of it is visible, it's the question if that's something we have to fix at all. So let's first add in the animation that as soon as you scroll down, that it tilts and the image fades in. And for detecting whether the image is in view or not, I actually want to use a package called React Intersection Observer. And if we look at their npm page, you see that they give you a hook called use in view. And with that hook, we can actually detect whether our image is in view of the current user. So let's add that one in first. We can do that by running yarn add React Intersection Observer. And then we can import use in view from React Intersection Observer. And we can use that hook right in our component. And that gives us a ref. That ref needs to be passed to the thing you want to be in view. So in this case, it's our wrapper div. And as you can see, it gives you a in view Boolean as well. So if we log out this in view Boolean and see what happens, we first get an error. And that is because we need to make this component a client component again. When we do that, we already see that as soon as the page loads, we first get a few faults because the page hasn't fully loaded yet, but then we immediately get true, which is because part of the image is visible, of course. You can, however, set a property called threshold. And this threshold is a number between 0 and 1 that tells you the percentage of the image that should be visible. So let's say, for example, we want to make this 40%. Then we can give a threshold of 0.4. And if we now go back to our page and refresh, it will stay false until we've scrolled about 40% and then it switches to true. But what you'll also see is if I scroll back up, it will revert to false because it has passed the threshold. And if we would use this Boolean to flip the animation, then it would also go back when you scroll back up. And that's not how Linear implemented in their website. So for that, you can actually add a trigger once Boolean. This way, as soon as it has been triggered, like now, and I go back up, it won't go back to false ever again. Also, if you scroll fully to the bottom, it would not go back to false. So this way, we can use the Boolean to detect whether the image should be visible or not. So let's start by adding in the class names package again. And then we can add a few classes when this image is in view. We'll add transform none because that will undo any rotate that's currently applied. And what also needs to happen always in this case is that we add transition transform to our image. And now I'm testing this. I'm actually seeing that this does not work because the transform is still applied. So in this case, the transform, since it's a custom property, it will be later in the style sheet and thus have a higher specificity than the transform none. So instead of only adding transform none when it's in view, we should also revert that. So if it's in view, it's rotate transform none. And if it is not in view, it is rotated on the x-axis. So if we refresh now, we see that it's skewed. And if we scroll down, we already see that the image flips. I mean, it's super nice, right? But they're doing a little bit more with their animations. If you scroll down, you see that they first scale the image down a little bit, then rotate, and then scale it up again. So that's, of course, something that's again, not possible with only a simple CSS transform. For that, we need a real animation so we can build in these steps. So I've quickly taken a look at their website, and this is actually the keyframe animation that they are using. So it starts with a rotate, then it goes to the same rotate, but with a scale of 0.9, and then it will undo the rotate as well as the scale. So it will become fully flat. So let's create this in Tailwind as well by going back to our config again. And then we add in the keyframes called, for example, image rotate, which started with 0% and had a transform of 25 degrees. Then we add the 25% step, which also had the rotate, should by the way be rotate on the x-axis, of course, and also had a scale of 0.9. And then we go to 60%, which had transform none, and the same goes for the end state. And then we also add in the animation of image rotate, which uses the image rotate keyframes. And then let's see how long this animation actually takes. It is taking 1400 milliseconds with the same easing, and forwards is also important to have it stay in its end state again. So if we add that, we can go back to our image, and instead of adding the in view transform none, we can now add in the animation image rotate. And that also means that we can remove the transition from here as well. Oh, and it should of course be animate image rotate, not animation. And if we then refresh this page and scroll down, we already see that we have the same scale animation as well as the rotating on the x-axis with just a few styles applied. And of course, really credits again to the linear team as well, because they came up with how this would animate, and that's what makes this look so super sexy. It's not that hard to replicate this when you already know how it should be built or what the animation would look like. So all the credits to them again. Next up is this glow behind the image, and especially if we reload this and animate it, you even see that it glows a little bit more when it animates. So for that, they added a separate div again to this element, which has a background gradient and a blur on it. So let's first copy in this gradient into our Tailwind config by adding a new gradient called hero glow. Instead of making a new element, I'm actually going to use a pseudo element. So I'm going to add a new row in the class names property here. And we're going to say before background hero glow. And that on its own won't do a lot because it will only render this background on a pseudo element that's currently 0 pixels in width and height. So what I want to do is give this a full width and a full height, and also give this a top of 0 and a left of 0, and then make this position absolute. And in order for that to be absolute to anything, this should of course be before absolute, to anything, we should make the parent relative as well. And then you see that this gradient actually pops up. Of course, the image should be on top of it, so let's make that relative and have a z-index. And then we should still add the blur that they've added as well. So we can add a before and then filter blur 120 pixels, which will then add in the blur. But one thing that's now happening is that we have added the overflow hidden, and that is actually preventing the glow from coming outside of the parent. So what we need to do to be able to see this glow is actually remove the overflow from the image wrapper and move it into the page, where we just added on top of the container that wraps everything that is part of the hero. And with that, you already see that the glow is coming outside of the image. It's not extending below it yet because we didn't add any padding. We can make padding Y for now. But as soon as we add more content below, it will also extend below. Having this glow this visible is actually also really nice, I notice now. But okay, if we go to Linear's website, we see that the glow is actually pretty subtle. And also when the image is still not visible, it's also, maybe it's not even visible at all. And it only glows for a second when it animates in. So let's see how this animation works. I quickly have taken out the keyframes from their CSS again, and what you can see is that by default it indeed has an opacity of 0, so it's not visible. Then it quickly goes to an opacity of 1 in the 10% range, and then it goes back to 2% opacity where it will stay in the end. So let's create this keyframe animation as well by adding another keyframe animation called image glow, which has 0%. Where it will be of opacity 0. And we also have to add in this really nice animation timing function, which of course, this is again, well, that's all the detail. If you just animate it in a linear line, it will probably look way less nice than also copying in this timing function. So again, this is why you have to have really good designers to really nail the details with these animations. We copy that over we can add this animate timing function. Then we're also going to add in the 10% step where the opacity was 1 and the timing function was this one. So opacity 1, and then we have the timing function, but we need to paste in the correct one, of course. And finally, we have 100% where the opacity is 0.2. Correct. Okay. And now let's see if there's also some sort of delay on it. It at least has a duration of 4.1. So let's add the animation as well. Image glow, which is image glow, and then a duration of 4100 milliseconds. Ease out and forwards again because it has to stay at the 0.2 opacity. And it does have a delay that is calculated, which is 600 milliseconds plus 0. So let's for now add 600 milliseconds hard-coded in here. Perhaps they reuse this animation somewhere. Okay, and then we're going to add this image glow animation to our before element. So that again will only be active when it's in view. Animate image glow, and it should be on the before. Let's see if it works. Oh, and immediately you see that the opacity is not applied yet. And that again is because the animation didn't start until we applied a class. So we also need to copy the opacity from our config, which is 0. So we need to add in the opacity 0 as a default value as well. Opacity 0. So by default, the glow is not visible. And then as soon as we scroll, we see the glow becomes visible and then fades really subtle down again. Next is making sure that the image fades in because it shouldn't be visible by default. And for that, they probably also added in a delay. So let's see if we can find that on the image. Yeah, it has a delay of 680 milliseconds. So for that, we add in our opacity 0 again, and then bring in class names again to be able to add classes when the element is in view. So that means that it has a transition of opacity and the delay of 680 milliseconds. And then when our element is in view, it should have opacity 100%. So if we look now, we see that by default, the image is not visible. And when we scroll down, we see nothing happens. And that is because I made the same mistake again. Opacity 0 should be gone when the item is in view. So instead of rendering it always, we should actually check, is it in view? Then it's opacity 100. Isn't it? Then it's opacity 0. So if we refresh now, we see that the image is gone and that it nicely fades in when the image turns around. Man, the people who come up with these designs, I love them. This is why I love this work. So the next thing that's still missing is this SVG in the background, which if I scroll down, you see in a second is a sort of outline of the linear design. So watch closely. You saw these lines appear really quickly. It's like a sketch of the design. So that's another small detail we still have to add. So let's for now copy in this SVG and add it in right in between. We remove all the classes because we don't need that. And let's quickly see how it looks actually. Right now you don't see anything because these lines don't have a stroke by themselves. So let's add that in right away by adding a class name where we again target with arbitrary value the path and then say stroke white, as well as a stroke opacity of 0.2. And for this, we again need to use an arbitrary value because Tailwind does not support stroke opacity as a selector we can use. And with these square brackets, we can actually add in everything we want. And if we save that, we already see all these lines appear. So this is the framework that you were briefly seeing for this split second. But again, this detail adds so much more attention to detail that this website is just so nice to use. So again, looking at their code, what they do to animate this is they animate the stroke dash offset. And by animating a stroke dash offset, you can actually animate a line or a path in SVG. And the only reason they're using an animation is because this way they can animate the stroke dash offset, but also in the end turn the element completely hidden as well. And that all completely by controlling the timing. So you could, of course, with JavaScript add classes to do these different things at different timings, but this is way more declarative to see what happens when. So we're actually gonna reuse this logic. So we're creating a new keyframe again called sketch lines, which at 0 has a stroke dash offset. Of note, it should be 1. And then at both 50% as well as 99%, the offset is 0. And then at 100%, the visibility will become hidden. So then we also add an animation for this, sketch lines. And this animation will be of a duration of 1200 milliseconds, has no delay, and has an ease out. And then this animation is then added to the lines. And of course, only when the animation is triggered again. So we use the class names package and then say in view is animate sketch lines. Oh, and this should of course also be on the path. And the final thing we need to add is tell the browser how many points the line actually has in this stroke dash array. So in the animation, they animate from 0 to 1. So that means that the linear team configured this line as if it only has 1 point. So that means that the linear team in this case decided to have this line only have 1 point, which makes sense in the case of a line because it's a line going from one point to another. But the dash offset is also used to animate from one point to the other point. So in this case, since it has 1, we need to set the CSS property of this dash array also to have 1 point. And we do that by adding another path class with stroke dash array equals 1. And then we also need to add in this offset as the default of our animation. And that offset was default 1 as well. So if you now look, you see that the lines are not visible. And if we now refresh, you see that the lines actually draw itself and then disappear again. And that's the moment where the image actually should fade in. So the next step is making this SVG position absolute, because then the image will lie on top. And of course, the full width and full height. And if we now scroll down, we see that the lines draw itself and then the image appears. The only detail that is still lacking if we look at their own website are these glowing lines around the image. You see that it's kind of random. They're constantly adding a glow on the top and on the right at random times. Sometimes there's 2 quick right after each other. Sometimes there's a bit longer of a delay. And I inspected this page to see how this is actually working. And what you can see is that they add divs into the page that represents these lines. And by giving them a random size and duration, you see that it gets this random vibe. You can, by the way, if you're on a Mac, it's Command-Shift-P, and on Windows, it's probably Control-Shift-P. And if you then enter Show Animations, you get this bottom menu where you see all the animations currently active on the page. And you can pause the animations there. And what that does is it stops all of the animations, which gives you the option to look at them in better detail. And what I can also do is I can slow them down to 25%. And if I then hit play again, you see that the animations now are a lot slower. There is, however, constantly JavaScript running in the background that will add all these new lines. So you see that there's actually way too many now because the animation takes 4 times as long. But this does give us the ability to see how these lines are animating. We can see now that the starting point of each line is always at the same place and that they also disappear at the same place. So the only thing that is different is the length and the speed by which the line travels. I tried to inspect the animation in the inspector, and even though it's showing me the name, there's no way for me to find the definition of this name. Not in the DOM, not in the source, not in the CSS file, so I'm not really sure what's happening there, but that means that for now we have to replicate this animation by ourselves. Luckily, I was able to find the gradient they use for these lines, however, so that's at least one thing we can use. Let's first make it so that we have both a top line and the line on the right side to show, and after that we can work on animation. To start with, we're gonna add a wrapper div where all of the lines are added into. And then in there, we are for now gonna add 2 spans, one for the vertical line and one for the horizontal line. First, I'm gonna add a new custom gradient for these lines. We call them glow lines for now. And we see that this gradient, in the way Linear set it up, is that it takes in a direction. And this direction can either be to right or to bottom, for example. And by setting the variable to that value, the gradient will already rotate its orientation. So we're going to leave this in because that's actually a super smart idea of them. So next we're going to add in that gradient by adding BG and glow lines. And we also need to make a display block because we are using a span for this. And we're going to position it absolute at the top 0 and left 0 for now. And we're going to give it a fixed width of, for example, 10 rem for now. And of course, we should also give this a height of 1 pixel. And we need to add position absolute to this wrapper div and make it full width and full height, as well as be positioned in the top left of the wrapper. And this way we can give it a Z index, so it lies on top of the image. And it should actually be a Z20 because the image is already 10, so it needs to be on top of the image. And next is we also need to set the direction of the gradient. So we can add custom properties in the style object. But for TypeScript to accept that, we need to cast it in TypeScript to as CSS properties. So it actually allows the custom variable declaration. The reason I am not doing this with Tailwind right now is because anything you define in Tailwind but do with JavaScript is not compiled into the final bundle, since everything is done during the build. And by the way, this should not be on the wrapper div, but should be on the span itself, of course. And if we do that, we already see the line appear. So let's see and copy this into the other span, but then make the direction to the bottom. And that would also mean that the position is different because it should be on the right in that case. And it should have a height of 10 rem and the width of 1 pixel. And if we add that, we also see that the line on the right side is working. The next thing we of course need to do is make sure that it randomly adds and removes these lines. So what I'm going to do for this is actually create a state object in which we remember all of the lines that are currently active. So let's start with removing this console. We don't need that anymore. Then we create an array called lines and put that in state. Let's already put 2 lines in there for now. The first line will have a direction of to bottom, a duration of 300 milliseconds, and a size of 200. And the other one will be to right with a duration of 800 milliseconds and a size of 150. So instead of directly rendering these spans, what I'm then going to do is I'm mapping through the lines we have created above. And in there, we render the direction. And later on, we will also add the speed and size. Or actually, we can already render the size. So let's do that right away. To do that, we add class names in again. And then we can say if line direction equals to the bottom, then we're going to add a width. And now I actually was about to set a new arbitrary value for the width. But again, this is then rendered with JavaScript. So Tailwind will not render all of the different variants that we're able to render on the client. So instead of doing this, we actually need to extend the style object and add the size in there. So if we add another property called size, we can set the line size in there. And then instead of setting a dynamic value for the width, we're actually going to use this variable here again. So we say var size and then add the rem back. And if it's rem, that also means that we need to divide this by 10 and then give it the height of 1 pixel. And in case the direction is to the right, we're actually setting a width of 1 pixel and the height equal to the size. This is also not right. It should of course be to the right, should have a height of 1 pixel and the dynamic width. And the line to the bottom should have a dynamic height but a width of 1 pixel. So if we do this, we should still have those lines. But it does not, and the reason is because you cannot render a variable and then suddenly attach a unit to it. What we can do though is add calc around it and multiply it with 1 rem. This way, it will actually convert the unit, the numeric unit of 20 to 20 rem. And with that, we have the lines back. Only it is on the left side instead of the right side. And that's correct, because we should add that into the dynamic values as well. Okay, so this way we're back at where we were again. Now let's quickly also add in the animation, because that way we can animate them and remove them when the animation completed. So let's first add 2 new keyframe animations. The first one is glow line horizontal, where at 0% the opacity will be 0. Then at 5% the opacity will be 1. And then we have at 0 also translate x of 0. And the same for 5%. So it first fades in. Then at 90% we have a translation on the x-axis of 400 pixels, just to name something for now. And then at 100% the opacity should fade out and it has moved 50 more pixels. And if we turn that into an animation as well, we get a glow line, and that should have a custom duration. So that will be a variable, animation duration, has an ease out and goes forwards. And then we still need to add in the animation duration, which equals the line dot duration, but that should also be in milliseconds. And when we load, we see that the line is there briefly, but then it disappears. So let's quickly double check the animation. Opacity 0, opacity 1. And that makes sense because the duration currently is 800 milliseconds. So let's make this 3000 for now. Let's it stay there longer, but does not move it yet. And that is because this should be transform. Always messing these up. And that makes this line move. The only thing is we should not add in this transform here, because otherwise it will go at a certain speed until 40 pixels and then have a different speed for the remainder. So we can actually simply remove that here. And then we see the line move to the right. The only thing is we've added an ease in out, and it should probably only be ease in, so it speeds up but does not slow down at the end anymore. And then it fades out. Let's also do the same thing for the vertical one, which is the same, but then translate Y. And then we can add in the animate glow line vertical as well. And make sure to also add a more proper speed. And then also this line animates. But even though they're fading out now, they're not being removed from the DOM. So that's the next step we still need to do. So for that, what I actually was thinking is if we add an ID to this line, that will be a random ID in a second. So for now, it's just test and test2, for example. We can tap in on an event called onAnimationEnd, where we can call a function to do something. So what if we would add a function, remove a line that takes in the ID, and then in here we call the function remove line with the ID, and this will then update the lines but remove the one that's currently being removed. And as soon as this is removed from its state, it's also removed from the DOM. So if we now inspect the page and we see that one is removed and the second one also gets removed as soon as this cleanup event is called. So that means that we don't have any useless elements in the DOM left. After that, we need to run some sort of interval in which every time a new line gets created and added to the DOM. But this interval also should be somehow random, because if we look at the linear website, you see that they don't add a line every second, but they do it a little bit more random. So to try to replicate that, I'm thinking of adding a use effect without any dependency. So this is only run once. And in there, we're running a set timeout. And this has a random interval of a number between 1000 and 2500 milliseconds, for example. Let's add in 1000 for now. And then see if Copilot can help us to generate a random number between. Random number between. Yep, this is a proper way to render a random number between two numbers. So let's use this function now to generate a random number between, let's make it 800 and 2500. So that means that this first timeout will be completely random. And what this timeout does is it will add one line to the array. So we can say set lines, where we get the current lines. And we then need to spread the current lines we have, as well as add one new one. This new one has a direction, a duration, and a size. So I see Copilot is already helping us a little bit here by giving us all these suggestions. And actually, most of them look fine. Let's see, the duration should be a random number between 1300 and 3500. The size should be random between 100 pixels and 300 pixels, for example. And then we have our random ID, which is actually pretty okay to generate a random number. So what this does is it adds one single line between a random number of 800 and 2500 milliseconds after this component mounted. But we should, of course, still wait until the component is in view before we start adding these animations. So first add in view as a dependency to our use effect. And if we're not in view, then we won't do anything. Next is we also need to add these set lines to our dependencies. So, and now we can remove our default lines because there shouldn't be any. And right after that, TypeScript starts complaining, of course. So let's quickly draft up an interface for our lines. That has an ID, that's string, and direction. That's either to bottom or to right. Size, that's a number, and a duration, that's also a number. As soon as we added that to our use state, TypeScript is also happy again. And now if we load this image, there should also be a random line that appears to the bottom. That's actually correct. Nice. Now it should also be random to the right or to the bottom. So let's also add in mat.random. It's larger than 0.5. Then it will be to bottom, and otherwise it will be to right. So that makes it also random between to the right and to the bottom. Yep, now we get a top one. Nice. And the next thing is also that once we have drawn one line, we actually want to register a new timeout to render the next line. So we can do that by actually adding this timeout in a function, which we call render line. And this render line gets called with the random timeout. That's a number. So this timeout is then actually passed as a variable to the set timeout. So what we then do is we call the render line function, where we again add in a random number between 800 and 2,500. So that would still give us the exact same result. Which would be true if we call this outside of itself. And here you see the line coming up again. And what we then do is right after we've set the new lines, we call the same function again with the same random interval. And perhaps as a first line, it would be nice if it would be pretty quick. So let's make that a little bit shorter. And by that, we suddenly see that we have all these lines popping up every now and then at a random interval with a random width, with a random speed. Super nice. I have the feeling that perhaps it's still not really the perfect gradient we're showing, but I'm not gonna debug that for now. Maybe I'll do that off camera and show this next time. The only thing we still need to do to make this work properly is also clean up when this effect unmounts, because otherwise, if React re-renders this component and reruns this effect, it could mean that there's actually suddenly two timeouts going on. So we can do that by adding a timeout ref, which is a user ref, which is null to start with. And its TypeScript type is return type of set timeout. And with that, we can set the timeout to timeout ref.current is set timeout. And then as a cleanup function to our effect, we can return a function that checks if timeout ref.current, it calls clear timeout of that current ref. So with that, if this effect gets unmounted, it will clear the timeout ref, so there is no timeout sticking around. And as soon as this effect is rerun, it will again call the render line function, which will set a new timeout for the new line again. And with that, we ended up at the end result of our second video. I hope you're just as excited as I am about this second video, because this video was a lot more about animations, and it's just a nice part of Frontend if you ask me. I am really happy with the progress we made so far. I'm super excited to see all these little details getting added and really the whole website coming to life. Just like the previous time, there's a link in the description to the GitHub where you can check out the code yourself. And there is also a link to the preview site where I've actually deployed everything we've built so far. So definitely check that out. And please leave a like and subscribe to this channel because it helps me tremendously. And I hope to see you next week with part 3.